και να σας καλημερίσω στο πρώτο σεμινάριο Επιστημονικού Προβληματισμού και Ανάλυσης. Ουσιαστικά γνωρίζετε ότι αυτό το σεμινάριο μαζί με το Σεμινάριο Hot Potatoes και το Σεμινάριο το τρίτο, το πάνω στο ράφι της βιβλιοθήκης, είναι η μετεξέλιξη του κύκλου των σεμιναρίων διδακτορικού επίπεδου που ο Γιώργος Σταμέλος ήθελε, οργάνωνε και έτρεχε για μια πολύ μεγάλη περίοδο. Προφανώς και αυτή η μετεξέλιξη των τριών σεμιναρίων οφείλεται στο Γιώργο και σε αυτή την πρώτη βρετική συνάντηση έχω τη χαρά να είναι προσκεκλημένες συνάδελφοι και φίλοι. Η Jeanne Chiron και η Elena Karachontziti που βρίσκονται στην Ελλάδα και στο Πανεπιστήμιο Πατρών με προγράμματα κινητικότητας. Now, my colleague Jeanne has been a lecturer at the Université Rouen since 17. After obtaining a doctorate on 18th century literature and history of education, she devoted herself to furthering her research on gender assignments in the history of schooling and became responsible in her university for training in gender equality, which has become compulsory in France in the initial training of teachers in primary and secondary education since 2020. Also, my colleague, and excuse me for that, Jeanne, a good friend of mine, Elena, is assistant professor in the same university. She holds a PhD in education sciences. Her research interests focus on citizenship, education, and on the European mobility impact on the global development of all participants. Now, before I'm giving the room to Jeanne, the title of the central presentation, it has to do with the resistance to the concept of gender in French schools, a decade of insight for the most contemporary teacher training. So, thank you for being here with us. This expected rainy day, we have sun at this time. And please, Jeanne, take the control of the room.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your invitation. I don't know if you hear me properly, but it's all right online. I don't see you, but I hope you might see me, and we have people in the room right here. We chose to do the presentation in English, with an English PowerPoint, so that it might be easier for everybody. And I will use a few quotation in French, but I will try to translate everything. So thank you very much for this invitation, and I'm really happy to be here with you and waiting for the rain, maybe, but with this wonderful weather we have. As you said right now, as I can introduce myself, I'm working on this new teaching that have become compulsory in France, because we have new curriculum in the teacher training since 2021. It's when it has been implemented, and we have included courses on, I quote, equality between girls and boys, and those classes are integrated to the lessons on values of the Republic in France, and those lessons are assessed in exams. So it has become very important classes, and I'm responsible of it. And to start, I would like to start then with the rather pretentious analogy, bringing together international relationship and international organization and my own little person. I would like to contrast, and it's almost a joke, but to contrast the United Nations with the courses I'm doing. So that's the point where it works. So it works very well. Great, thank you very much. So these comparisons is starting with the United Nations and this Fourth World Conference on Women that was held in 1995 in Pekin, in Beijing, which title was Fighting for Equality, Development and Peace. This conference has been quite well known with a very important discourse that has been held by Hillary Clinton called Women's Rights Are Human's Rights, which has become a feminist quote. But I wanted to quote this because at this conference, it's the first time that the concept of gender was defined internationally. And I quote this definition, it's this: gender refers to the relationships between men and women based on socially defined roles assigned to one sex or the other. And we kind of know this, this definition, but this definition on an international level shows that this concept has had political recognition and legitimacy and was seen as necessary to address gender inequalities. Yet, 25 years later, in my little university, when I first taught to the future primary and secondary teachers about equality, so it was September 2021, I hesitated. Where and when should I introduce that concept of gender? My past research made the use of this concept necessary, and I will come back to it. But I was full of doubts. At what point in the course was it wise to introduce this concept? And how do I explain to my future colleagues the mixture of fear and uncertainty that now seems to surround every teacher, in France at least, and researcher also, in the use of this term? The context obviously played a role. I had in front of me 250 students silenced by the lecture format and with whom I would not have the time to discuss, to take into account the uncertainties, maybe the understanding they might have. But moreover, I was worried. How would they understand my involvement to me, teacher, which with this term, gender, suddenly seemed less neutral, seemed dangerous, and if I bore the responsibility of endangering their thoughts. So that's why I would like to dedicate myself here with you during this presentation to better understand these hesitations in front of potential resistance to this concept. What is so problematic about it? After 10 years that I've been working with this concept, where did all those hesitations and worries come from? So that's why to work and to be here with you, my theoretical readings were reoriented to understand those doubts. No longer readings on the concept itself, but books and articles about the oppositions to this concept, which has multiplied on the occasion of several mediatization of what has been called in France, in Italy, and in many other countries, the gender theory that is said to have arrived in French schools over the last 10 years. So that's why I'm gonna, we decide with Elena that I might spend some time to redefine and give you a conceptual synthesis of the concept itself, so that everybody's clear about it and may understand maybe a little bit more precisely, and give you some examples of fields of application in educational sciences. And then I will address those oppositional strategies of what has been called an anti-gender crusade, with a very metaphoric word. So I will start with this concept of gender and try to give you a little clarification of it. And that was the first question I wanted to address to you, because I didn't know. For whom among the colleagues who are present here and online is this concept operative? Did you use it in your research? Elena told me it was somewhat, and I don't see the people online, so I cannot see your answers, but do you see people saying that they use it in their research? No.
There are 12 people online.
There are 12 people online, and maybe I see if you, nobody is raising the hands, so I guess nobody is using the concept. For whom is it a little bit known theoretically? I know, Elena, you know it a little bit, so it's not really well known. And for whom is it a real mystery? So it's in between. So you've heard of it, but so I guess on Elena's advice, I'm going to start with a little synthetic, and it's a concept that already has 50 years of history. So I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to simplify and maybe not mention many of epistemological and linguistic and also political controversies that it may have created. And but I'm going to start with this synthesis. So you may know that it has been created more than 50 years ago by American feminists, and it is now very useful for thinking about several important phenomena in our contemporary societies, both equality and its limits. That is to say, the structural difficulties that societies and individuals face when the political project of equality between men and women tries to be put in place. So that really equality and its limits. But also in terms of law, and in particular the rights of women and gender minorities. This concept permits to address inequalities and discrimination associated with feminist and what we call LGBT plus activism. So it is those structural inequalities that this concept allows for a more detailed understanding. And it is based, I think, well, with other researchers, on two main definitions. And I'm going to try to simplify it, to expose it right now. And those definitions are really linked to the evolution of this concept in history. And so the first can be said, the opposition between gender and sex. So this is an opposition that has created a field of studies that you might have known of, but you might not have seen this text that is considered one of the bases of those theory that has been written by Anne Oakley in 1972, which is called Sex, Gender and Society. And this is considered as a genesis of a field of study that is in the United States. The gender studies inherited from the second wave feminist movements that go back to the 60s and the 70s centuries. And that's what we call now gender studies. In the 80s, in France, the gender studies has been translated really late, almost in 2000. It was the first translation. Well, the inherited translation. But what might be interesting is to see that this concept that says that gender is a social construction exists way before this concept of gender. We have more other concepts, and you know already this term, and it exists as social sex, and it is used in Greece, or it is used really broadly to talk about the social relations of sex. And this social construction of masculinity and femininity has been defined as a cultural and historical fact and artifact. And there is something we might know, you maybe know, of course, is a quote that is well known from Simone de Beauvoir from Le Deuxième Sexe. So it's back to 1949, is one is not born a woman, one becomes one, on ne naît pas femme, on le devient. And this quote is really well known, and I think we might use it also to say that one is not born a man either, one becomes a man. That's what is trying to show those gender studies. And that means that men and women internalize through all their social relationships since early childhood, the expectations that are associated with their birth sex. That is to say, gender norms. And that is the main proposal of this proposition that you already know. But maybe to clarify and to be more on the research part, it's interesting to see that there are two main features in this theoretical proposition. The first thing is that it is a proposition that is constructivist. That is the opposition to essentialism. It is to say that this intellectual operation has a main aim is denaturalization. It's a complex word, denaturalization, I'm sorry. That is to say that what seems natural is considered as a social construction. I give you some examples that we all know. Women are weak, men are strong. Therefore, women must be protected. They are in danger when they are not accompanied. And therefore, men cannot cry. They cannot be weak. They must protect women and children. And all those thoughts that seem natural can be analyzed as cultural and social construction. So that's the main thing, and we'll see that this constructivist stance is one of the main arguments that are problematic for the contradiction of this concept. That means also that it's a counterintuitive concept. It goes against one of the greatest certainties that we have as human beings, is that there are two sexes, and what is related to their opposition is natural. And this concept of gender makes it possible to show that this opposition is culturally constructed, and those differences that exists, it's not the fact that they don't exist, it's the fact that they are used to justify a gendered order. And that's the main part of this constructivist part, because it's to say that this natural argument is constructed to the detriment of women and gender minorities. So here we come to what is the analysis of domination system based on the difference of sexes. And I wrote here with the capital letter and the bold characters for difference of sexes, because it has been a field of studies of feminists before gender to try to work on what they called a belief, the belief that there was an absolute difference, and that difference could be used to justify inequalities. And I think one way to say that, and it's a way that feels really clear, it's what says Bourdieu when we use a concept that comes in opposition with the majority belief. He says that, I'm sorry, I forgot to talk about that. He talked about a heterodox knowledge that is opposed to an orthodox knowledge. We have the orthodox knowledge of binarity opposition, and here is the heterodox knowledge. So I wanted to quote Wittig, because Monique Wittig goes further and says that since we are in opposition, this opposition can be exemplified by heteronormativity. That means that the fact that women and men have to be heterosexual as a definition of their gender. So this text, the Straight Mind, is a very important text to understand that heterodoxia in gender studies shows that if heteronormativity is also a norm that is linked to gender binarity. So the second part that might be interesting, that is really theoretically interesting, is that this concept makes us adopt a relational perspective. we don't work, one needs to study one sex in relation to the other, because sexes are groups and categories that are constructed in opposition. And this might be interesting for us, and I think it is very interesting for us, in order to understand the phenomenon of homophobia. Homophobia can be understood with this concept of gender, because since homosexuality is considered to be outside of the norms of masculinity and femininity, it is considered to be unnatural. And this argument of unnatural makes a lot of discrimination. And this makes us understand that sexual reproduction, therefore heterosexual opposition, is also considered to be the norm of sexual relationships, and which, as we know, are not limited to the procreation operation. So that might be one of the arguments. So that's here, I'm sorry, that's here that I wanted to mention Monique Wittig saying that heteronormativity is linked to gender. And last thing that I wanted to tell you in this approach is that this constructivist prism was first applied to social identities. But now, since the 20s, it is also applied to what we call hard sciences. So I'm calling this genetics, epidemiology, physics, biology. And that is to say that is questioning now in art science the binarity, masculine and feminine, as not that sure. And that might be something that is quite problematic for many people who discover those studies, is that those studies concern the differentiation in biology, for example, of sexual characteristics. Questioning, so these biological arguments that we have that men and women are naturally different. And many works have been done on intersex situation, what we call intersexuation, and is not called anymore intersexuality, because sexuality would mean that there is a sexual intercourse. The intersex situation is people who have non-binary sexual characteristics. And it's a relatively frequent situation, because almost 2% of the population have those non-binary characteristics. And it can be at the level of the chromosomes, it can be at the level of the gonads, or hormonal. And for example, that we have discovered, there has been discovered a gonad that are mixed, that we call ovotestis, and that generates sexual ambiguity. And the text where you will find a very clear exposition of this is this text of Anne Foster-Sterling, who is a biologist, an American biologist, really well known. And what is really interesting with those research is that it makes us in a dual position. Either we continue to consider this situation as anomalies and making them pathologies, or we question the male versus female binarity. And we question it anew, and asking maybe ourselves if this absolute difference is not rather a spectrum than a binary opposition. So I think those last arguments might be the ones that are the most questioning of this binary gender, and that is among the works that are the most criticized, of course, also. So that was for the first part that you already knew, and I guess, this opposition between gender and sex. But as the studies advanced, the gender has been more and more considered as a system. That means to say we don't talk in plural today about genders, as we might have talked in the 80s, saying the genders, there is the male and the female. Today we talk about gender as a neutral to talk about this system. Because since the 1920s, the new generation of researchers who use this concept use it to break with the common way of thinking about gender difference. And they have explored the implication of unequal binary system. The best known The best known is, of course, Judith Butler, that you've heard of, Gender Trouble, which is a text that has been that has had a huge audience in the United States and in everywhere in the world. And it's one of the texts that is well known by the opposition that we'll talk to you about later. One remark quite interesting, the translation in French has been only made in 2005. So it took 15 years to translate this text. But this questioning of the unequal binary system had been done before and had been done by feminists way before. And I don't have time to talk a lot about that, but I would like to quote two works. One of them is a work in anthropology. And there is this concept of valence différentielle des sexes. It's a concept that has been created by Françoise Héritier, who wrote this text, so you see, in 1995. And she was trying to understand why in every culture there is this differentiation of the value of men versus women. And another work that I wanted to quote, of course, is the work of all the 70s Marxist feminists. You know that the feminist Marxists worked on gender just like they worked on classes. That is to say, they created concepts to oppose masculine and feminine and to show the domination. And there is this concept, which is really interesting, and we talked about it a lot with Elena. It's the concept of sexage that has been created as a model with esclavage. That is to say, it's a concept that has been created by Colette Guillaumin, who wrote way before 1995, and she was really influential in France in the 60s and 70s. And she did comparisons between the situation of racism and the situation of sexism. So that was to give you a little bit, to show you how long this concept have existed before being called gender. And today we have many definitions, but I think this definition that has been done by Laure Bérény can be very useful, is to define gender as a system of hierarchical B-categorization. So it's really the categorization with hierarchy between the sexes and between the values and representation associated with them. So that's maybe another way to define gender that really make us understand the system. And what is linked to those definitions and to those research is the idea of asymmetry and hierarchy inside of this concept. And what shows many work is that those asymmetry and hierarchy are certainly reconfigured in historical construction. It moves, but all human societies present an equal distribution of resource in favor of men and in favor of women, and a valorization of the masculine to the detriment of the feminine. And that works for values, for representation, and we can see it in the education of children, when masculine values and masculine activities are really well for girls, and girls invest way more in those kind of activities. When it's in the side of the woman, it can be not as well valorized. So other terms have been used, male domination, which is a concept that has been really broadened by Bourdieu in this text, La domination masculine, but also that idea, and which is maybe the most interesting idea for us as teachers, is that the normative order sanctions gender deviance. That means whenever we have a child or who is not in the norms of gender, there is a sanction. And we can see that, of course, in sexuality, but we can see that also in, I don't know, makeup for boys, or in talking too loud for women. There are so many examples. I'm sorry, I didn't prepare them. These ideas have now been really renewed with this concept that you might know and may know, I'm sure, is the concept of intersectionality. And it's a concept that is really old now, that has been first theorized in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a jurist in the United States. And she wrote this text about a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine. And what is really interesting to know about this intersectionality is the fact that identities are contextual and always constructed by the complex imbrication of class, race, gender, sexuality, age. So it's a renewing of this inclusion of gender in a larger works. And what is interesting to know about this concept is that it's linked to what we call the third wave feminism, influenced by the Black feminism in the United States. And what is really interesting for us to know is that they emphasized the power relations between women. And it's a critics of women who were the feminists of before, that have been created from white, heterosexual, middle or upper class women that did not consider the different forms of experience of sexism, and its sexism lived, for example, by Black women in the United States and abroad. So those gave many kind of studies that I'm quoting very quickly, what we have called the subaltern studies in the 80s, and what is now called post-structuralist and queer research, which is now the open and broad fields of research of today. So it has 30 years. So as you see, and I'm through with this synthesis, I could have shown you many other things, but I wanted to show you first the critical strength of this concept, because it allows us to deepen many questions. First of all, gender inequalities. The discrimination that are links to norms of masculinity and femininity, and I told you a little bit quickly about homophobia. But moreover, it can make us understand the persistence of these inequalities that is hard to understand without this concept. And the persistence is really linked to what we call the naturalness of this social relation. It's because we have the argument of natural that it's really hard to make things evolve. And of course, it's interesting for the critics of the gender order, which is can be called gender order. And it brings to the forefront various relations of domination. So you see that it's a very political concept, of course. And it creates, moreover, difficulties because there are various theoretical spaces, great complexity. There are plenty of quarrels between those studies. There is no consensus between in the use of the concept. And so when we work on gender, it's a very complex concept. But I think we can use it very interestingly in fields of educational sciences. And I'm going to show you very numerous examples of fields, and I will develop only the last example because otherwise it will be really long. And we come back to the others later if you wish. I'm going to show you the plan of my classes to my students, but not do you the classes I do to the students. So in educational science, this concept can help us understand, because there are research on what we call gender representation in school curriculum and in textbooks, for example. And I'm working in research with some of my students on that. But we can also, there is a lot of works on school geography that concern gender occupation of space. Schoolyards, for example, and the organization of football inside the schoolyard, for example, and power relation. There are studies also on educational orientation and guidance to understand the difference for the girls in fields that are less remunerated, less interesting financially. I'm really saying that too quick, but there are many studies interested in that. And there is also studies on violence in the school environment, linked to sexism and LGBT phobia. And there is a huge field that work on the influence of gender stereotypes on the teachers themselves. So, for example, on the interaction and the distribution of the speech, which is not unequal, but differential. That means we see that now inequality is not really, doesn't appear clearly, but there is a difference in the way of distributing the speech between boys and girls. There are studies on differentiated assessment, and it's really clear in moments of orientation. And in the management of sanctions, we know very well that boys have way more sanctions, but when girls have sanctions, they have very harder sanctions, because the fact that girls go out of the norm is deeply, way more deeply sanctionized. Thank you. And what is interesting in all those studies is that always the discussion is on, we cannot only talk about gender. We have to talk about class. We have to talk about the origins. We have to talk about the socialization. It's a parameter, interesting parameter, but is always linked to other phenomena of identities. So intersectionality is everywhere. But I would like to show you just very quickly some of the works on masculinities in schools, because I think that what gender gives us is the possibility to talk also about boys. And it's not only something that concerns girls. In the wake of this text of Rouen Connell, which has become really well known, that is called The Masculinities, that was published, you see, again, 30 years ago, there has been a great amount of work to better understand the greater representation of boys in school transgression. For the numbers I have from Sylvie Herald, it's more than 80% of the pupils sanctioned or punished are boys. And what Sylvie Herald works in this book, which is really interesting, I translate the title for you, it's donc La Fabrique des Garçons, The Boys Factory, Sanctions and Gender in Middle Schools. What Sylvie Herald shows in these books is to analyze those transgressions as gendered behaviors. And she shows that because it's claimed as gender behaviors by her pupils that she interviewed. And she proposes to understand these transgressions as boys being caught between two normative systems. That the normative system of the school, which is based on the values of obedience, discretion, wisdom, calmness, which are traditionally associated feminine, gender feminine values. And in front, a second system of norms, which encourages heteronormative masculinity, including being cheeky, breaking the rules, monopolizing attention and space, being strong and sexually dominant. And so this book works on this opposition and this system of norms, and she proposes an interesting concept. She calls it the medal of manhood. And I think this concept is really interesting to designate the paradoxical valorization of punishment and sanctions for boys. Because in this analysis, it becomes quite understandable. It means it's a medal of resistance to the system of norms of school, which are in contradiction of the norms of masculinity that the young pupils have to perform. And conversely, for the boys who do not recognize themselves in these stereotypical male behaviors, this normative system has painful consequences. And boys suffer also from those gendered norms, and it is shown by the works on school bullying. We know that school bullying is also targeting boys that have good results, and it's with this proposition understandable. So there are other works that I'm not quoting that show that. Well, I'm coming to the end. I hope that I have shown you of this first part that the question of gender is a key issue to the reflection on inequalities and their permanence. Hence, the great hope that we had for educational policies that take up equality issues and make equality training compulsory in teacher training. I'm coming back to my little person in Rouen. However, this change, this political change, has been enforced in 2021 after a decade of mediatic quarrels which have considerably influenced social consciousness through a very powerful media battle that has been waged against the uses of the concept of gender at school. So that's why I wanted to show you right now is what we can call the oppositional strategy of what has been called by some researchers an anti-gender crusade. So I'm really happy to be here with you and to have worked on that because I discovered that this resistance is part of an international mobilization against the use of the term gender and who is responsible of the invention of gender theory. You have seen there are theories, there are studies on gender, but there is no gender theory. But this resistance has been initiated, and I'm quoting this book, by the Vatican. And that's what is shown in this book, is that since 1995, and linked to the conference of Pekin, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith and the Pontifical Council of the Family has published a lot of, has made a lot of publication and investment to develop what Garbagnoli calls a discursive device. The creation of a discursive device, that means an argument like gender theory, aimed at delegitimizing and stigmatizing minority struggles and knowledge. And as you've seen, gender is a knowledge that comes from those minority, if we can call women a minority, but it comes from those kind of knowledge. And I wanted to quote you the title of an article that I think is really interesting. It's from Odile Philot, The Invention of Gender Theory, the White Marriage of the Vatican and Science. And this invention has been, so I wanted to show you the bibliography that's here, has been, I'm doing a synthesis of that, but what I wanted to make first is an essential remark, which you can see from the titles of these books, is that these mobilizations against a pseudo-gender theory in schools are strongly linked to the law on marriage for all. In France, there have been these laws on marriage for all, which was voted in France in 2013. So you see, it's in the title of the first book, From the Vatican to the Manifestations for All. It's the other part of, it's the, what we have called la manif pour tous, or the demonstration for all, was the opposition to the marriage for all. And we can question the reasons for such an offensive and so many publications. The title of the book of Béraud and Portier, Catholic Metamorphosis, is really interesting because they show that the mobilization of the church and of Catholics, widely speaking, has found in gender a common adversary, and that it has created a political movement that did not exist as much before. But the reasons, I guess there are many, but we can say first the extension of marriage to same-sex people, and those kind of this extension of law has started in Denmark in 1989 and then spread to 22 other countries in Europe and in the world also. And as Pope Jean-Paul II said in Georgia in 1995, and I never thought I'd be quoting a Pope in a seminar, he said, it's an international offensive against marriage. So I think the the battle lexical of offensive, international offensive is really clear. Second reason, I think, it's, and that I found in this first book by Gabarnioli and Triaro, which I thought really interesting, is a real transformation for the Catholics of the conception of the role of woman in the 2001st century. Jean-Paul II, I don't know how to translate this Pope, since that Pope, there has been a notable evolution in Catholic discourse on the submission of women. We cannot talk today about submission of women. It's not, it doesn't fit in our societies. And researchers show that a rhetorical transformation has taken place since the 1970s, but really a lot during that Pope, developing the more acceptable concepts of equality in difference that we hear a lot. We are different, but there is equality, but we are different, and which is a concept that is really important for Catholics, but also the valorization of feminine virtue. And moreover, a new feminism, which is called new feminism for Catholics. And of course, all this amounts to attempt to renaturalize, remember to say again that there is a natural difference in the concept of gender. And as early as 1995, in the wake of the Beijing conference, the Holy See's delegation at this international conference has asked first to delete the word gender, and second, if it was used, to define it as, I quote, biological sexual identity. That means an absolute nonsense about gender, which cannot be said biological. So I think this transformation in conception of the role of woman might be a clear explanation for those reactions. And of course, the third reason is the fact that heterosexual norm is no longer transcendent. That gender studies make heterosexuality a product of the social order and no longer an absolute norm. So of course, for Christianity, it's unbearable. And at the end, and it might be the aim of this resistance, it's legal concerns. Because all these mobilization have in opposition the homoparentality, the fact that 2 men or 2 women could have children, medically assisted procreation, of course, and surrogate motherhood that questions also the family. So it's clearly a resistance to a natural conception of gender, sexuality, and family. And as says Dérault, the supporters of this anti-gender crusade go so far as to speak of a conflict of civilization. So it's a really deep struggle and war. And what is interesting for us to understand is that to create gender and gender theory is to create a common enemy. And Garbagnoli talks about a rhetorical artifact because it allows to attack many people. First, different theories related to this plurivalent concept that I showed you, but also different fields of study that analyze the functioning of gender and sexual order and its forms of naturalization, as we say, but also political category used by LGBT activist movements, because it's a really important concept. And at the end, a category that is mobilized by law, administration, and political issues, just like NATO. In front of this danger, the movement has been really structured. So it's what is clearly shown in those 2 first books I'm showing you there. And the movement has been structured mainly in France and in Italy, and also in Brazil. There are many examples of the Bolsonaro campaign that use, and you will see many links between France and Italy. And this movement use great media and institutional power for example, the creation of Italian and Spanish institutes. There has been the creation of the Bioethics Institute of the University of Navarra, which is a creation of the Vatican, but that shows as a bioethic institute. And there is also a site that is called Vigigender's website. I had prepared a slide, but we'll come back to it if you want later, because I'll keep my time instead. But this site, I'll show you that, it's the Vigigender site that wants to draw communication and argumentation against gender. There has been conference of experts, and there has been a huge ramification of Catholic association and groups. And we'll come back to that if you wish. I want to do the last part of my presentation about the quarrels about gender in French schools, because that's what interests us. The creation of a media confrontation around the danger of gender or gender theory. You see here a quote from the site I was telling you about, Vigigender. You see the expression, stop to gender at school. And gender, as I told you, doesn't have the meaning that is research meaning. These quarrels aim at schools when educational policies existed way before in France and in Europe, and they have existed since the 80s in favor of gender equalities, and since the 90s for the fight against homophobia. But those policies that existed before had little interest for those attacks and had often remained without effects because it was not that well known. What happened those last 10 years, and I will give you a brief historical background, I'm going to go a little bit further, faster. We will focus just on one thing. First, there has been in 2011 new programs of life and earth science for the class of première, and there was this new part of the curriculum that was becoming a man or a woman. And many textbooks used the concept of gender to explain becoming a man or gender. And there has been a strong media mobilization linked to the presence of the concept of gender. And we won't work on that, but I worked a little bit on it, and it's very interesting because the textbook used the concept to show there was a social construct, but they never used the concept as to say that there was no binary natural opposition. They didn't go to that point. But still, the media mobilization has been really hard on that occasion. In May 2013, there has been a conference against homophobia and LGBT phobia in primary schools that has been organized by one of the main teachers' unions in France. And there has been also a strong media mobilization. And I quote two front pages. I didn't put them here, I'm sorry. Two front pages of Le Figaro, which is a very important media in France, right wing. These teachers who want to impose gender theory in schools, and other titles, Gender Theory Enters School. So really creating danger. In 2013, we have had a new school bill, and the amendment that was trying to talk about gender equality has been rejected 3 times. And at the end, we had equality between women and men. And we're going to conclude on that. There has been this policy that I'm going to talk about, and that's what we're going to focus on, what is called IBCD of equality. And there has been a lot of different mobilization and regular media calls about what we call education on emotional and sexual life, which is a teaching that is compulsory in France. And we have 3 sessions per year of all cycles, from nursery school to high school, and it's very little implemented, often external speakers, associations, and so on. And whenever the state says that we have to implement again those classes, there is always a media resistance. So to focus on the ABCD of equality, which seems to me maybe the most interesting thing, it has been a measure supported by the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Women's Rights in the school year of 2013 and 14. And it was a program that was experimentation on 600 schools. And I'm just quoting you quickly the press release that has been done in 13. The aim was to bring to teachers useful tools for addressing equality between girls and boys through teaching sequences and entries in existing official programs, in order to make children aware of the limits they set for themselves, so gender stereotypes, of the all too common phenomena of self-censorship, to give them self-confidence and to teach them to grow up with respect for all others. As you see, there is nothing we can complain about, and there is no gender relation. They already knew. But the consequences were incredible, because this experimentation, and the term experimentation has had a huge influence also, was the occasion of a very strong media battle in the context of the mobilization against the law for the marriage for all, which had been voted the year before, and was used systematically, the concept of gender. So with the help of a few slogans taken from the mobilization against the gender theory, I will try to show you the rhetorical stakes of this anti-gender crusade. So it has created what some researchers call a moral panic. So, for example, here you have la théorie du genre entering, alors s'immiscer is really intruding into French schools. And you have clearly the use of the singular that we saw, la théorie du genre, and that erases an entire field of studies with its intellectual histories, its issues, its different positions, and resulting also in an invisibilization of all theories that affirm the construct nature of gender difference. But also we have those kind of slogans. So you see, théorie du genre à l'école, stop. And you see that the use of theory, we see also a lot of ideology in France and in Italy. And the effect of this qualification is to oppose science and those two words that are presented as equivalent, theory and ideology. And it's really interesting because they are both very political notions, theory and ideology, that can even be defined in contrary the one to the other. We can say that theory shows us what ideology hides. You see what I mean? It could be one of the definitions, but it says to be theory or ideology. And moreover, you see the sign of the snail. The snail would approach dangerously those poor two boys and girls, because they're pink and blue, and create the image of a diffuse danger, because it's a symbol of a hermaphrodite animal. And that might be another way of demonization, is the disqualification that serves to frighten. And it's even more worrying when it comes to teachers who have couples in their responsibilities. There is another expression that I found is gender theory indoctrination. So you see, it's really expressions that are really scary. Second, other examples that I wanted to show you is that the use of gender stereotypes. You have here this don't touch my stereotypes. We have the idea that gender identities should be protected from the danger of deconstruction or loss of reference points. Whereas, as you know now, and knew before I told you that, gender studies do not show that they are free, those stereotypes. They are obviously constrained we are linked to gender stereotypes. So this tacit argument raises the very strong fear of gender indifferentiation. Could be that, and there is this idea that the people who work on gender theory would have an incentive to change sex. Boys would become girls and girls would become boys. And this idea is clearly in this image. No thanks, it's not their gender. And you see the image of those hands giving a mustache and a bra to the, it's really, I think it's really interesting. And that's what I wanted to tell you about this amphibology. That means ambiguity on the terms, saying that there is various interpretation of gender that are indifferentiation, homophobia, of course, and danger for pupils. So the gender of indifferentiation. And you might see what is written on the low of the second thing, but I really think it's kind of funny. It's stop to women who dress as women, stop to women who dress as men, stop to the carnival. So well, that's the, I think it's a little bit funny, but it's also kind of frightening. And you see, of course, the binary blue and pink colors that have been very used for the demonstrations. And I'm going to finish with maybe what could be, in the last examples, a little more clear about the effective rhetorical effects of these slogans, is the fact that they use reversal and diversion. We had ideology, now there is familyphobia that has been popularized in the same way as the term heterophobia. You see, which is clearly an argumentative reversal, fallacious, but expected in this polemical logic. We can say that it could be, but way more disturbing is the misuse of gender violence. So I here used, and so that you see, I'm sorry for the quality of the image, you see that it's exactly the same design for Italy, so that shows there is this international design. And you see here, it's really exactly the same design, but the term used is basta violenza di genere. And this is really disturbing because gender violence refers to sexual and sexist violence against women and gender minorities. And it is here used to describe the violence that would be carried by the people working on gender studies, by me, on you. And I think it shows the aim, the problematical aim of this, and I let you appreciate. So that is not linked to the school, but to abortion. And this is an anti-abortion slogan advocated by the Italian group Citizen Go. And you see the transformation. The abortion is the first cause of feminicide. So you see the transfer of the terms, which is incredibly convincing, and it's an absolute misuse of the term feminicide, of course. So you see, there has all these expressions that are reversals and that are really problematic. Positive reversals, of course, were those of the valorizations. So we had the family days and the demonstration for all. So what are the consequences? And I'm touching to the end of my presentation. For schools, there has been rumors and panic that were really important for our colleagues and for the parents, because this anti-gender mobilization with the strong media echo was relayed by social networks and Twitter that worked a lot during that. There has been a huge article on that is very interesting. And parents and teachers who had not been sufficiently trained on these issues were helpless, panicked. And this panic was linked also to school withdrawal days that were organized by parents. And and that had a strong mediatical echo. This article that is really very interesting, because Marie Bachou worked on more than 60 interviews with teachers, and she shows that the teachers had a critical distance towards those quarrels, but they testified their fears first, their fears of the parents' reaction, and also they never had the experience of the reaction of the parents, but they anticipated, fantasized, and internalized the opposition to equality programs. You see, the media had so much efficiency that teachers were scared and touched by this climate of tensions. And another interesting finding of Marie Bachou's study is that teachers who had previously carried out small-scale actions on equality, who were invested in those kind of activities, then in 2014 emphasized the danger of the extreme proposals put forward by gender theory. So those teachers thought that gender theory existed and was dangerous, and they quit their activities. So the media battle was won, clearly. And I'm going to show you an excerpt from the evaluation report of the scheme that illustrates the heavy-handedness of the suspicion effect on teachers. I quote, as you can see here. So it's the rapport d'évaluation, the evaluation report. The teachers would never have imagined that parents could see the school as a source of danger, never thought that the school and they at the same time could be suspected of having an organized plan that would allow them to violate the modesty of children, to violate their privacy, to intervene in their sexuality, to manipulate their conscience. And I think it shows you the deep transformation in French society linked to this media, huge power of media and creation of gender theory. The long-term consequences, numerous deletion of the term gender. For example, this book of one of our colleagues in Rouen, which is called Déjouer le genre, Outsmarting Gender, was out in October 2013 and was stopped. The diffusion was stopped. And it has been transferred to this new title that is way less dangerous, Equality and Mixity, and no more gender. Where even more frightening is the cancellation, and you remember Sylvie Herald, who was the colleague I told you about the masculinity works and the fabrics of boys. She talked about censorship of the word gender because she had cancellation of her conferences during that period. And so you see that it has had many consequences, and there is one also in Rouen, very precisely. There was, excuse me, I've lost my, there was mission, I'm sorry, a mission of the Rouen Academy on that was called Equality and Gender, and the name of the mission changed for Girls and Boys Equality Mission. So you see that there has been a reinstatement of the binarity that gender studies sought to interrogate. So it might be in this perspective that we can understand the title of my new teacher's modules on equality of the 2021 teacher training modules. They are called Women, Girls and Boys Equality, and not gender. The question of gender was even not mentioned in the framework texts of these new programs. Equality is presented there as a work that should focus on two main issues that are really important issues, of course, school orientation and stereotypes, I quote, between boys and girls. And that's how I want to conclude, is a quote of Éric Fassin in this article that I wanted to quote earlier, but I forgot, its ministries censor the word gender, so it's really it's a left-wing media, so the use censorship is aimed at. And Eric Fassin, who is a researcher in those questions, says, replacing gender equality with equality between girls and boys will not address the order of things. The idea of ensuring equality without touching the norms is totally absurd. And to close this with a more larger conclusion, I will quote a colleague who said that these polemics on gender, but on other words, function as a language and thought police operations. By controlling the circulation and use of certain concepts like Islamophobia, gender, race, state racism, these operations prevent action on social norms, those at least that ensure the privilege of groups in a dominant position. By diverting and disqualifying the ways of naming the unequal and hierarchical social order, the aim is to make the public believe that only talking about Islamophobia will prevent criticism of Muslim religion. That talking about race, that it's a social concept also, in the name of the relationship of domination, like social class, would be almost being racist. And that talking about gender would be a disguised incitement to changing sex. I hope I didn't make you consider widely your sexual representation and change anything. And I really thank you for your attention.
Yes. Jeanne, thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation. I think with a theoretical thought and analysis on a very complex concept that I'm not specialized on gender. And it was very interesting with the connection that you tried to make of that theoretical discussion with a resistance and difficulties on community, on education, and on teacher training. And of course, the difficulty to implement related educational policies. So thank you very much for that presentation. Now, the question that anyone could make could be on Greek, who could make the translation, on English, or on French. So, feel free to address any question. Anyone? Well, if there is, yeah. And to inform the people that are from distance, we are 5 people here in the room, and I am a minority. Okay. So, Elena.
You talked about the Vatican's reaction to the resistance. In Greece, we are used to have a lot of reaction from our church because we don't separate. And as we know, the French state is late. There is no connection with the church. So how
yeah, I guess the France has many myths about its independence, and one of them is laicity, and one of them is the separation of state and religion that seems to be an evidence for French people, but as far as we talk only about educational policy or even mediatic influence, we know that now one of the main owner of the media now owns more than 60% of the media, French media. So it's really analogic to Berlusconi's situation. Has a brother who publishes books that are Scientologic books. So, of course, we need to have less confidence in this separation and to see that I kind of like the concept of Marx, which is always so useful. I think the media dominant ideology, and they are everywhere, and it's really interesting to try to understand that with our colleagues in the public policy situation in France, to make a link that is not really exactly what you said, Elena, but we have the situation of the university during the teacher training is now coming back to the Ministry of Education. And so there is a really difficult situation because we have absolutely not the same culture. The fact to talk about research, for example, to the students, it's not in the habits of the colleagues that do the teacher training. So, and we see that there are some things that we don't talk about. I've been invited to a conference to a place that I will not quote, and they told me to change the name of my conference because it was a title, it was on inclusive writing, and they told me that it was better. I could talk about it, but let's not put it in the title. So those influences that are not only religion, but can be also a kind of a reaction that comes from many places. The analogy with Greece is a way to better see what we don't see in France. Thank you.
It reminds me a paradigm that Dr. Stamelos, Professor Stamelos, usually say. He is not here because he has 6 hours of lesson in the master program. He was saying that for a period of a decade, when you had a paper on an article with a concept or the notion of ideology in its title, it was not going to be published during 80s and 90s. And the writers that, okay, they are clever people, have the same article, the same paper, and just change automatically by the work machine in the docs, the name ideology with theory. And their articles and paper going to get published in that way. So it's similar.
Yeah, it's really similar. And it tells us at the same time a kind of censorship is a term that is really deep meaning, but it tells us also what are the strategies to be published. Yes. And I know that, for example, when I have some kind of resistance from my pupils to the concept of gender, well, then talk about inequality, because it questions, it addresses the same, but you are less in danger. Oh, I talk to them about social sex, no problem. So it's a strategy that has a good, it's a Janus, it's a double way to work.
Thank you. So, yeah. So, from the physical presence, Maria Papadimitriou is going to.
It's not a question, but I want myself, there is a picture. We have a lesson about gender in high school. And we were talking with a colleague against I think very confident enough to talk about it, because we don't know as many things as I would like to know. Talk to children about it, and I'm afraid to present a non-binary things about gender because it's a small village where
And a small school.
yes, and I'm afraid parents will find it inappropriate.
Yeah.
And it's exactly what we see about. I guess I followed a class in Geneva, and one of the colleagues suggested a way of working on that is just to talk about stereotypes, but to make the children understand on two levels the stereotypes. First, what are the stereotypes on clothing, on behavior, on sports, and so on? They know that. But to have a second, after they work on that, but what does it create as inequality? And here you're doing some gender studies. You're making them see that it creates inequality between boys and girls. And at the same time, there is no parents that should be. And my students ask me that a lot about homophobia, saying when you talk about sexuality, we invade the privacy and so on. And there I have an answer that I guess can work all the time is what are the responsibilities of the school? And we are supposed to work against discrimination. And we know that children that are victims of homophobia and pedophilia have 7 times more chances to commit suicide. So this is health public policies, and maybe to have always give to my students the laws giving them you have this in the code of education, you have this, and I advise them to talk about the director of the school, but it's the responsibilities of the school work on that. But of course, it's really hard, and for me also, it's really hard to do a synthesis on those concepts. You have 50 years of studies, even more. So it's hard. Thank you.
Υπάρχει κάποιος άλλος από τους μακρινούς που θα ήθελε να παρέμβει? So, Dr. Βασιλόπουλος. Yes. One moment, because we can hear you, actually.
Okay.
Now? Θα κλείσω το μικρόφωνο.
Yes, I don't hear you. I don't hear you. I'm sorry. Can you hear me with your
One, and then fix it. Δεν σε ακούμε. Οκ, δεν πειράζει.
Arrivo che avevo visitato l'Université Rouen Normandie Academy because the ambition of the pupils is low, is there is a link also with the gender stereotypes. Behind all that, I think that we can find the locality of teaching staff. As your worship, teacher training, having, and there is no one to want to change the locality. do you have a resistance
From the
from
colleagues?
your students?
From my students? That's what I was saying at the beginning, is that one of the characteristics of our change of curriculum is to have lowered the price of the formation. And so we have a huge amount of magistral courses. And it's a catastrophe to teach those kinds of things without being able to discuss. And so, no, I don't see enough resistance because there is no space for them to express. When we have the travaux dirigés, the TD, I don't know how to translate that, the smaller, it becomes way more interesting because that's where we can discuss, as you said, we need to find arguments, we are not convinced, there are limits, it's that part that is interesting. And that's what we saw very clearly in those classes last year. And because I have 7 colleagues that do those classes also with me, I do the magistral courses and some of the comment tu dis donc les TD, Eristeria, and in the Eristeria,
Laboratory classes.
in the classes, in the
Yeah,
small
laboratory
classes,
classes, yeah.
my colleagues last year told me they didn't really get it. We have problem with the concepts. The concept that they didn't really understand, and that's normal. You understand nothing when somebody is just telling you. But we worked on practical subjects. Like we have practical cases and what happens if in a school that or that happens, and we work together. And they told me this year that they felt like there had been changes. And our interpretation as a team was not my wonderful classes, of course not. It was one more year of post-Me Too culture. There are sociologists with social media. We read things, we are exposed to things, and that makes maybe way more for the colleagues and for the young teachers than a 6-hour class. So, could be used. But the second part of my answer is to the remark of the cultural part. I realized that most of my pupils think that many boys from out of France or who are poor, who are a little bit Muslims or that, are more sexist than the others. And for me, it's one of the aims of this teaching is to show them that it's a question that is a system. And as racism, it does not depend on where you come from. It's a system. There are differences, but if we always say that the sexist is the other, as we say, as my people say very often, it's in the families. No, it's everywhere. And some families argument it more, but I think it's one of the main aim of this teaching is to understand that it's a systematic. That's why gender system is interesting, is that it doesn't show that it's in some families, because I really believe that those kind of teachings can link to a new form of racism that is a complex situation. And that's one of the things that we want to work on now. Thank you for the question, Lydia.
Thank you very much, Elena. I think we do have a problem. Yes. Θα ήθελε κάποιος άλλος κάποια ερώτηση από τους ανθρώπους που είναι εξ αποστάσεως ή εδώ. Let me thank you very much, Jeanne, for that very interesting presentation and discussion. And now for a little bit of time, I have given to Elena co-host for 5 minutes, because we think that it's necessary to say some things about the program of Erasmus that she is responsible for. Elena, you may do it from your computer. I think you may do it from your computer. We will try it. Do it from your computer. Yeah. Σου έχω δώσει. Sorry, Jeanne, for the Greeks. Okay.
You have closed the session.
No. Okay.
I was searching, but you shouldn't.
No, I didn't manage to do that. Sorry for that delay. Focus. No. Okay.
But I can
Okay. It's okay. Κάνε το PowerPoint για τους μαθητές.
Ωραία. Μπορώ να το παρτάζω. Καλησπέρα και από εμένα. Λοιπόν, ήθελα να σας παρουσιάσω ένα Erasmus project στο οποίο συμμετέχουμε το Πανεπιστήμιο της Rouen ως coordinator και σαν συνεργάτη στο Πανεπιστήμιο της Πάτρας. Θα ήθελα να πω πως η ενασχόληση με το Erasmus ξεκίνησε σε συνεργασία με τους συναδέλφους από το Πανεπιστήμιο της Πάτρας. Πριν 3 χρόνια μαζί με τον Αντρέα τον Βασιλόπουλο, τους κύριους Νικολάου και Καμαριανό, μέσω του ΕΑΕΚ είχαμε μια υποτροφία για να δουλέψουμε στο impact του Erasmus, να μελετήσουμε το πρόγραμμα Erasmus σαν καταλήτη για βιογραφικές μεταβάσεις στους συμμετέχοντες. Και έτσι μετά ήθελα να συνεχίσω, ήθελα να χτίσω ένα προφίλ γύρω από την ευρωπαϊκή κινητικότητα. Και πάντα σε συνεργασία με τους υπόλοιπους συναδέλφους, πέρσι απαντήσαμε στην πρόσκληση του γαλλικού Erasmus Agency και αποφασίσαμε να ασχοληθούμε σχετικά με τα έμφυλα στερεότυπα. Η ιδέα γύρω από τα έμφυλα στερεότυπα είχε να κάνει πρώτα απ' όλα, τώρα τα δείχνω ανακατεμένα, λόγω ότι υπάρχει η στρατηγική της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης γύρω από την έμφυλη και γύρω από την ισότητα των φύλων. Επειδή στη Γαλλία, όπως είπε και η Jeanne, το 2021, η ισότητα αγοριών-κοριτσιών έγινε μέρος της εκπαίδευσης των δασκάλων και των καθηγητών, και ακριβώς θεωρήσαμε ότι ήταν ένα θέμα που άξιζε να το μελετήσουμε μέσα από μία διεθνή σύγκριση, γιατί έτσι μας επέτρεπε να καταλάβουμε καλύτερα τους μηχανισμούς που βρίσκονται πίσω από την δημιουργία των έμφυλων ανισοτήτων. Οι συνεργάτες μας σε αυτό το πρόγραμμα είναι, είπαμε ότι η coordinator είναι το Πανεπιστήμιο της Rouen, το Τμήμα Επιμόρφωσης των Εκπαιδευτικών. Τώρα το δίκτυο χτίζεται γύρω από πανεπιστήμια και ιδρύματα δευτεροβάθμιας εκπαίδευσης στην Γαλλία, Ελλάδα και στην Πορτογαλία. Τα συνεργαζόμενα πανεπιστήμια είναι το Πανεπιστήμιο Πατρών και το Πανεπιστήμιο της Εύωρα. Στην Ελλάδα συνεργαζόμαστε με το Λύκειο Βέλου και την Ελένη την Κραβαρίτη, και με το Λύκειο Βαρθολομιού και την Ανίτα τη Λάκα. Γενικότερα όλα τα συνεργαζόμενα σχολικά ιδρύματα είναι είτε από περιφερειακές είτε από αγροτικές περιοχές, γιατί θέλουμε να αναδείξουμε ότι την intersectoriality που ανέφερε η Jeanne, δεν ξέρω πώς μπορούμε να το μεταφράσουμε στα ελληνικά, ότι υπάρχουν και οι κοινωνικές ανισότητες και οι πολιτισμικές πίσω από τα έμφυλα στερεότυπα. Έτσι λοιπόν οι στόχοι του προγράμματος είναι να ενθαρρύνουμε μία κουλτούρα ισότητας στα σχολικά ιδρύματα, να κατανοήσουμε πώς τα έμφυλα στερεότυπα δημιουργούνται και να τα αποδομήσουμε, να καταλάβουν οι μαθητές και οι καθηγητές ότι τα ίδια ζητήματα που απασχολούν διαφορετικές χώρες υπάρχουν και σε όλες τις χώρες και σε διαφορετικές χώρες της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης, να αναπτύξουμε την σχολική φιλοδοξία των μαθητών, να αναπτύξουμε τις διαπολιτισμικές ικανότητες των μαθητών και των καθηγητών. Οπότε όλα αυτά στοχεύουν είναι γύρω από το να ενδυναμώσουμε την επιμόρφωση των καθηγητών και των εφήβων. Όλο αυτό το πραγματοποιούμε μέσα από ένα πρόγραμμα κινητικότητας, από τα εκπαιδευτικά προγράμματα που προτείνουν τα πανεπιστήμια και τα σχολεία, αλλά και μέσα από ένα ερευνητικό πρωτόκολλο. Οπότε δεν είναι καθαρά ένα εκπαιδευτικό πρόγραμμα, υπάρχει και έρευνα. Το πρόγραμμα θα διαρκέσει 2 χρόνια. Έχουμε ήδη καθυστερήσει, κανονικά έπρεπε να έχουμε ξεκινήσει από 1η Σεπτέμβρη, αλλά υπάρχει κάποιο διοικητικό κόλλημα στο γαλλικό Erasmus Agency. Και τα παραδοτέα μας, έτσι που έχουν, πώς θα γίνουν θα τα concevoir, πάνω στα οποία δουλεύουμε ύστερα από έρευνα, είναι η δημιουργία ενός gender escape game, το escape game που γνωρίζουμε όλοι, αλλά έχοντας σαν θεματική τα έμφυλα στερεότυπα, το οποίο θα μπορούσε να χρησιμοποιηθεί στα πανεπιστημιακά ιδρύματα επιμόρφωσης των εκπαιδευτικών για να υπάρχει active, για να είμαστε στη διαδικασία ενεργούς μάθησης. Θα υπάρξουν παρουσιάσεις σε διεθνή συνέδρια. Με τον κύριο Σταμέλο έχουμε αποφασίσει να προτείνουμε ένα ειδικό τεύχος πάνω στον αντίκτυπο των προγραμμάτων KEA 220 στην ολόκληρη ανάπτυξη των συμμετεχόντων, ώστε να δημιουργήσουμε έτσι ένα διεθνές δίκτυο γύρω από το συγκεκριμένο θέμα. Θα φτιάξουμε εγχειρίδια σχετικά με την αποδόμηση των έμφυλων στερεοτύπων, στα οποία θα απευθυνόμαστε στους δασκάλους, στους καθηγητές, αλλά και στις οικογένειες. Και θα υπάρξει στο τέλος και μια διαδικτυακή ημερίδα, στην οποία θα συμμετέχουν όλοι οι συνεργάτες, και με τη λογική να ανοίξουμε περισσότερο για να φτιάξουμε ένα νέο πρόγραμμα στη συνέχεια. Αυτά ήθελα να είμαι σύντομη, γιατί έχουμε ήδη καθυστερήσει. Χαίρομαι που βλέπω ότι κάποιοι από τους συνεργάτες είναι ήδη συνδεδεμένοι, αλλά και βλέποντας ότι είναι παρούσες και νέες συνάδελφοι, θα μπορούσαμε στο μέλλον να φτιάξουμε κάποια νέα συνεργασία. Να δουλέψουμε πάνω σε αυτό. Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ.
Εμείς ευχαριστούμε, Έλενα. Πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα και η προσπάθεια που γίνεται. Συνεργασία 3 χωρών, 3 πανεπιστημίων, το πω πιο σωστά, και κάποιων σχολείων. Οπότε όλο αυτό που δεν είναι μόνο ΚΑ20, αλλά είναι και ένα ερευνητικό, είναι εξαιρετικά σημαντική προσπάθεια, και γι' αυτό θεωρήσαμε, προετοιμάζοντας λίγο, κουβεντιάζοντας λίγο το πώς θα είμαστε σήμερα εδώ πέρα, ότι θα ήταν μια πολύ καλή ιδέα να πεις 2 λόγια γι' αυτό, γιατί είναι σημαντική προσπάθεια και είναι καλό αυτό να το σκεφτόμαστε και για το επόμενο.
Και είναι στο πλαίσιο της εργασίας μου με Πανεπιστήμιο Rouen και Πανεπιστήμιο Πατρών, οπότε τι καλύτερο να το αναπτύξουμε.
Okay. Υπάρχει κάτι που κάποιος θα ήθελε είτε να ρωτήσει, να τοποθετηθεί, εκτός από τις ευχαριστίες που μας στέλνουμε. Okay. Now I think that there is a time to end that meeting. Thank you very much. I hope that we didn't tire you. Hello. Elena, thank you for being here and saying about the Erasmus and for your help. I have to thank first Maria Papadimitriou and Vera, Marilina, okay, for being here, and the people that are from abroad at distance, and they managed to stay all these 2 hours with us. Thank you very much. Hoping that we see you in the next seminar, and have a nice weekend, the rest of the weekend. And sorry, Andreas. Then say sorry, Andreas, for not be able to ask whatever you want. Everything is okay. Right, and Andreas in Greek.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.